Hello everyone and welcome to the Festive Tech Calendar 2021. Today we are going to talk about naming conventions for Azure resources. Another year has gone by and it's my pleasure to be part of this amazing event again. Please make sure to also check out all other content that is published every day of December, and all of it's prepared by an amazing Azure community. This year we are also fundraising to help Girls Who Code. If you wish to help, please scan this code and donate. Any amount helps. Just before we start, I would like to quickly introduce myself. My name is Vukašin Terzić. I'm a full-time digital nomad and I work as a solution architect for a Microsoft partner company KPCS that is based in Czech Republic. I've worked with Azure for the last 6 years and I hold 17 active Microsoft Cloud certifications. I'm also a Microsoft MVP for Azure and a Microsoft certified trainer. Today's session is a little bit unusual for me. I'm not going to actually show you how to make any policies, and I'll just talk about them instead. Creating these policies is actually an easy part. Instead, we are going to answer 4 important questions that you should ask yourself before you start. Why do we need Azure naming convention defined in our design? Well, this question isn't really Azure or cloud specific. Having a naming conventions prepared as a part of our environment design is useful for many reasons. I'm sure everyone has some kind of naming policy for different things we create in our on-premises environment, like servers, hosts, maybe firewall rules. Someone has it even for files. Name of a server can contain a lot of information. For example, the role of the server, if it's a physical or virtual, if it's a production or test, applications running on it, operating system. That is useful, right? Well, of course, that's just an example. A security person would tell you that that's bad practice because attacker will know exactly where to go or what server to target. And you should give your servers some generic non-descriptive names, but that's not the point of this talk. These useful things related to naming convention also apply to everything we create in Azure as well. But there are several differences that make this more important and more useful in Azure than it is on premises. When you look at your resource group, you see many different resource types in one view. Also, when you create one virtual machine, you get many different resources that are related to that, such as disks, network cards, IP addresses, and so on. Each service that we create is a different resource type, and each resource has a different naming rules. Some of them support long, complex names, and some of them only short name made of small letters. Some resources need to be unique only within the parent resource, or perhaps within the resource group, where some other resources need to be globally unique in entire Azure environment. So you can see that things can get complicated quickly. And for an experienced user, this can also get frustrating and lead to creating resources with not describing names. And the cherry on top of that, in most cases, is that it's not possible to rename things in Azure. So if you don't like the name, the only way is to delete and create the resource instead, which is not always possible and cheap to do. Using carefully prepared naming convention in combination with a tagging strategy in Azure can go a long way. I found it really helpful when I can look at a resource group or a virtual network and quickly find out to which subscription it belongs and if it's a production or, for example, some kind of dev test environment. The rest of information can then be found in tags that are applied to resource group or individual resources. So that we now established that the naming conventions are useful to tell us to what resource type and in what environment we are looking at, let's talk about how to define a useful naming convention in our environment. Good starting point is definitely the Cloud Adoption Framework. that will provide some basic examples and guides on what to include in the names. The way how this information is presented makes it really easy to adopt provided examples to our environment and then build more on top of that. It's a good practice to also familiarize yourself with the naming rules and restrictions first, since different resource types have a different naming rules. For more info about those rules, check out this link. Now, it might be also tempting to try to come up with a naming convention for all 800 plus existing resource types in Azure, but that will take a very long time and you will probably not end up using most of these anyway. What I like to do instead is to start with the naming necessary things like subscriptions, resource groups, networks, subnets, managed identities, apps, and so on. It's more important to establish the general rules that can be reused for any other resource type depending on the rules and limitations that apply. You should also define some common prefixes that you plan to use or abbreviations as well. Following these simple rules in combination with existing examples from Cloud Adoption Framework will set you up to a good start. And now let's talk about enforcing these naming conventions. So, in the ideal world, we would like to make sure that everything is strictly enforced and that no one can create a resource that does not follow our naming convention, right? In theory, that can be achieved by using Azure Policy. We can create a policy that will identify the resource type and then check if provided name is in the correct format. So let's take a quick look at that, how that really looks like. Here I have a naming policy for the resource groups. You can see that the chosen resource type is a resource group. What I usually like to do is to create individual policies for single resource types and then assign them all together as an initiative rather than trying to combine everything in one policy. For some similar resource types, this is definitely doable, but having them separated like this makes things more readable in the end. So in this example, I'm trying to enforce a simple resource group naming. It should start with RG, then dash, environment type, then dash, and description. So it's simple like that. Now, notice a few things here. First, I'm not using regular expressions or anything like that. And that's because Azure Policy does not support that. I have few things I can use like hash or stars, but not much actually. And so that means that to achieve this like some complex naming, I need to repeat these blocks. And my example here is very, very simple, but this can get really complicated, especially if you need to use different rules here, like not all of it at the same time, but just this or that. So that can be really complicated and lengthy as well. Then another thing you can notice here in my example is that I'm not trying to limit the number of characters where the star is. So user can theoretically try to enter name that is too long, and that will fail even when they follow the naming convention rule here. This can be sorted, of course, with Azure Policy. Another example related to the length, for example, name of virtual machine resource can be longer than it's allowed within a Windows operating system. And so if you are creating a virtual machine from like image from store, what will happen is that your virtual machine will be named same as the inside computer name inside of your Windows, right? But if you choose a long name for your Azure VM, computer name within the operating system will be shortened to 15 characters, and then you will end up with server name being named differently than the virtual machine resource name. So keep that in mind. And also, Look here, look at those two names. This is something that Azure creates when we start using backups or Network Watcher. And so I had to add it here as an exception because if I enforced this and those names were not allowed, those services will not be provisioned, those resource groups will not be created. So we need to keep those things in mind. I have this simple policy applied to my test subscription. So now let's see how it works and what is the end user experience with this. I will now try to create a resource group with a name that is not allowed. So let's try that. You will see that the verification will pass because we didn't enforce like some rules, but when we try to create, that will actually fail. And what we get here is error message saying the resource wrong name was disallowed by the policy. It does not say much here, so this is not enough information for us. So we have to go in here and take a look actually at the information and try to find which policy this was, which will tell us here in the policy display name. And then from here we can take a look what are the names allowed and the formats allowed and try to read it from there, or to look into documentation and basically try to come back with the allowed name. So right, so this should be allowed, and if I click now, it's going to create that resource group. I don't think this is the best user experience we can face. Definitely it would be better if user try to do it correctly on the first time, but it will definitely force them to look into documentation and get this correctly. Now, if we create a bunch of naming policies like this for each resource type and then we apply them, we can achieve enforced naming convention. But do we really need naming convention for every single resource type? That's a good question. I think that we should only enforce it if it brings the value. And that's not always the case. So, for example, enforcing it on a resource group definitely brings value. Same as enforcing and requiring specific tags to be applied. We want our environment to be consistent. We want to have the information we need from Azure portal since it allows it. But we need to be prepared that enforcing anything in Azure can cause some issues and failed deployments. There are some services that create a resource group on their deployment, and they don't ask us for a name or a region or tags. So obviously this will fail. And sometimes it's not about failed deployments, but also about convenience. There is a thin line between that and value that correct naming brings. So for example, let's go back here and try to create something similar, something familiar, such as virtual machine. So if I try to create a virtual machine, and we are going to create one right now, so here I need to enter the virtual machine name, right? So we know that our naming convention for virtual machine is like this. VM, I don't know, test 01. And let's say this fulfills our our naming convention. Just gonna quickly fill this up. Short password, of course. All right. Now we select the disk, but look at this. There is no chance for me to select the disk name here, or at least like the OS disk. I cannot name it from here. Then we go more forward, and I don't have any virtual networks in this subscription that I can use. And so it's going to offer me a different virtual network, or it's going to let me create one. But good news is that from here I can obviously create one, and I can say, okay, so my naming convention is like this. Test. Okay. And then in here I can also change my subnet, right? Okay. So great. So that means that it's going to create those two resources with the name I wanted. Perfect. For public IP address, right, so we don't want that name, we want a different name, which will be public IP, and then VM test 01, right? So that's the virtual machine name. All right. Or actually, let's have that created as well. Let's skip all of those things. And let's create. So now look what's going to happen. It's going to create our virtual machine with the name we gave it to. It's going to create a virtual network with subnet and a public IP address. We defined all of those names. But look at this, network security group. And that was actually not defined by us, the name, but it's still creating it. And then you're guessing correctly, a few more things. He's going to create a virtual machine network interface with the name, oh it's here, with the name that we did not provide. And it's going to create a disk with the name that we did not provide. So what does that mean? Well, it means that if we enforce those naming conventions on those two resource types, or those three resource types in this case, a disk, a network interface, and the virtual network security group, this deployment would fail because those resources we cannot create this way. And so the workaround for that, for a user, would be to create network security group associated with a virtual machine or a network. Also to create a network card and associate with a virtual machine, and so on. Which will make this complete experience for creating virtual machines from Azure Portal completely unusable and much more difficult. Of course, there are ways around this, and that will be easy to define all of those names if we have to create this with PowerShell or with the CLI or with the templates. Obviously, in these situations, we can define those names, and preferably we should be doing it programmatically anyway. But in some scenarios, or in some use cases, there will be users who are not familiar with the PowerShell or with deploying from templates, and part of their workflow or their job would be to create those virtual machines. And enforcing those policies for those three, or let's say not for this one, but let's say for network interface and for disk, would make their life and their job much more difficult. Now, will that bring us some value back if we decide to do that and enforce naming for those two resource types? Yes, the value will be that it will be consistent from the look at those two, or like at this, from the look at this resource, we will know that that's like a network card interface, and we will know, if we use the right name, we will know with what virtual machine is connected to, right, or associated. But that's not a value that is high enough for us to make those people lives so much more difficult. So those are the two resources where I absolutely never try to enforce naming policy, unless the entire environment is, of course, run by infrastructure as a code and no one is actually using Portal, and those like workflows like deploying virtual machines from Portal are not allowed. But in case you ever want to do this, it will make a creating virtual machine from Azure Portal completely unusable for you, and you will have to do workarounds, create things before, and then associate them, and so on and so on. Makes everything really difficult. And so, if you're not enforcing it, are we going to end up with a messy environment? Well, depending on the size of your IT management and user structure, probably yes. So the first thing that we can do to minimize that impact is to train our users. Trust me, for me as a user, it's easier if someone tells me how to name things, then I don't have to think about it, right? But to make that work, we need to first make that documentation and then give them easy access to it. No one is going to remember all the resource naming rules. But if documentation is just a few clicks away, then we don't have to. The reality is, however, if users don't have access to documentation and they have to go and look for it somewhere in a file share, or there is a link to it buried somewhere in the email, and then they have to go to 100 pages documents to find it, they are not going to do it. So first thing, make it easily accessible for them, and that way they will always refer to it and locate to it. I found that for me or for users that I work with, it works the best if we create an Azure dashboard that contains information like naming policy, tag policy, and links to full documentation if needed. Let me quickly switch back here, and so I can show you an example of such a dashboard. This is easy to create, and you can see that I have a few things here. You can add much more. Do not make it overcomplicated, but add only the necessary things and share it with your users and tell them where it is. So for them, next time when they start looking for something or creating something in Azure, it's just a few clicks. They don't need to leave Azure Portal. It's right there for them, ready to refer to it. It works great. Another way to keep consistent environment is to avoid creating things manually by users from the Azure Portal and adopt infrastructure as a code. Deploying everything from predefined and tested templates brings a lot of benefit that are much greater than just keeping resource names in the line. All resources are deployed consistently and safely. Everything is documented and easily repeatable. And those don't have to be only like ARM or bicep templates. You can also adopt this by enforcing users to use shell like PowerShell or Azure CLI as well. I am personally a big fan of infrastructure as a code, and I do this a lot. But from my experience with different customers running Azure, I learned that this method will probably not fit every environment, depending on the complexity and IT admin team skill set. If they're not ready to adopt it, they will still be using Azure Portal anyway. We can also use Azure Policy to help us keep an eye on the resource naming. If we are not enforcing it, we can at least do audit for the names. And I know that by the time the policy detects this, it's too late already and the resource was already created, but still gives us some control over it. We know who did it, which user did it, and we can instruct them to do it differently next time. And sometimes things are created as like a first test or something like that, so we can still fix this before it goes to production. And finally, even if we have well-trained users and they create everything with desired names, we can still get into a situation when we don't have the naming convention defined for some of the new resources we have never used before. Users will sometimes do their best to name it, so it is similar to rules we established, but sometimes they won't, and they will give it a very bad name. For these cases, we can forbid deployment of any resource type for which we did not define the naming convention yet. In this case, user will have to come back to IT before they are able to create something, and by that time IT will add the naming convention either to document or create like enforcing policy for it. Personally, I don't like this approach because it's creating a bottleneck, and it might like stop users from doing their work, and they will have to wait for you to allow it. But it might work or even be necessary in some scenarios, so it's an option. And that's it. That's the end of our little talk today. Thank you for joining me and for visiting the festive tech calendar. Happy holidays and keep clouding around.